right, so I do want to talk about analytics for analytics. So I'm Phil from OneModel, and you got a good introduction of what we're all about. So today, I do want to weave a few different themes together, and so I thought I better bullet it out for you. Can you get there we go. Yeah, so we can keep track of it, and the panel just now was also wonderful. I think there are so many different themes we want to talk about today, and so I want to kind of offer you this sort of very concrete example of a way that you can think about using tools like machine learning kind of embedded within the work that you do as a people analytics team. And that is really then going to be just one example of kind of the falling cost of doing some of the technical work. So I want to leave you with kind of a particular example, but also talk in general about the value of all of this people data that you have. So, you know, at OneModel, we talk with organizations and people analytics teams all the time about, you know, kind of building data models and making investments in your data infrastructure and moving beyond spreadsheets and, you know, setting up that data lake or that data warehouse and kind of that foundational thing that causes you a lot of grief while you are trying to go out and do people analytics. So I want to kind of focus on that particular problem today, because as people analytics leaders, you all are making investments in people data. So I want to kind of offer up this idea of how do you think about the value of that investment, and then how can you use more AI tools and machine learning in particular to tell a different story about how valuable that data is, and in a sense to become analytical about how you're doing analytics. So the punchline here is that I think I found something that helps us talk very concretely about what value is in our data. I think it's something called an F1 score, and I'm going to explain to you what that's all about. If you're not into machine learning already, I'll give you a little bit of an overview, so we'll get a little bit in the details there. And then I want to zoom out at the end and kind of say that this idea of using machine learning, not to, you know, do predictive analytics for your stakeholders, but using it almost like you would use a pivot table, like taking this piece of advanced technology and using it in almost a trivial way, that's the kind of thinking we have to get really good at, because, you know, like you just heard, hey, maybe we're a year and a half away from these tools being ubiquitous and, you know, merging with them and all of that wild stuff. So how do we get ahead of thinking about how we might use tools in different ways? And that's a lot of themes to weave together. So we're going to do the best we can here, and I'll try to keep an eye on time as well as we do that. Given that we have a lot of things I'm going to go through, there's multiple ways to win. So on one hand, you could walk out of here just feeling like, okay, that's a new idea, that's interesting, and I may want to try, you know, running a predictive model in kind of a low stakes way to get some information about my people data. So you might take that idea away. If you're not overly familiar with machine learning yet, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of how you think about how good a machine learning model is. So we will touch on precision, recall, and then F1 score as part of that. And then finally, you have this theme that you could walk away with, which is how do we think about, you know, deploying tools in non-obvious ways? When the cost of building a model falls, you can now start to do things with it that you would never have considered before, which is kind of the whole fun part about thinking about technology and innovation, and so we get to spend some time thinking about that. And I'll leave some time for questions at the end here as well. So let's jump right into kind of that main topic, that more concrete piece of what I wanted to talk about, which is, you know, when you run a people analytics program, you have to think about making investments in your data. And that can be a frustrating part of being a people analytics leader. You know, we all know that you can take data and you can put it into Excel and you can do VLOOKUPs and pivot tables, and you can kind of limp along doing that. And then eventually you have to start to, you know, turn your sights on a bigger picture of like building, you know, some data infrastructure. And it isn't necessarily what you all enjoy spending your time doing. You want to do analysis, you want to figure out the optimal way to staff the battery line, and instead you have to stop and you have to think about, well, how do we get the data into a place where we can do this in a really scalable way? And so I thought it would be nice to offer up a way to think analytically about that work. By analogy, you might think about it as building like a Fitbit or a Whoop strap, if you all do that, for your data so that you can enjoy this feeling of getting better at your data and measuring the value over time. All right? And because it is a true investment situation, it's painful to say, I'm going to hold off on doing that analysis for you, which I could just do in Excel really quickly, and I want to stop and I want to say, okay, we need to work with IT, we're going to build a data lake, we're going to talk to a vendor, we're going to make this investment. So how can you kind of add some visibility to the progress that you're making there? All right. So if you want to do that, if you want to have a yardstick for how you're doing, or meter stick, yardstick we'll say, you need to know what direction you're trying to point. And so what I want to offer up to you as kind of the first part of this premise is, let's think about the value of your data as how good is it at predicting the future. Let's say that we do all of this work and we have all of this people data because our goal is to predict the future. This is like really fundamental to like what we do as humans, gathering data about the past, storing up memories, it helps you thrive in the future. Data is just a record of the past. If you understand the past, you're able to steer toward better outcomes and avoid, really adverse consequences as well. So what if we kind of put a new stake in the ground and say, yeah, there's compliance, yeah, there's reporting, but we're going to say that our data is valuable insofar as it lets us predict the employee outcomes that we care about, which is probably going to be who becomes a good employee and do they stick around. So you really might not even need a lot of models for this, but we'll kind of, for the rest of the talk, we'll just use voluntary attrition because it's the one we're all familiar with. So we're going to say our data is valuable if it helps us predict the future. And it turns out that this is exactly what machine learning does, right? So when you build a machine learning model, you gather up a bunch of data about the past, you apply, complicated algorithms to that data, and you end up with a predictive model that you can feed data into, and it will give you an estimation of what's going to happen in the future. So you could kind of think about machine learning models as kind of these like ultimate historians in a way, which I think is a fun way to think about a machine learning model. And then when you build a model, you get to test exactly how good that model is. Okay, and when you are able to then say, our model is, say, X% good at predicting the future, you know how valuable your data is. Your data gave you the ability to predict at this level of confidence, okay, how well, what are our employees going to do? So that means, as you think about these data initiatives, you could say, well, today we've got core HR data. We know someone's job, their location, how much tenure they have, maybe their basic salary. And then you could run a model and you could say, okay, that predicts this well, and it's probably not going to be very good, right? But it tells us this much about what our employees are going to do. Now, if you add in learning data and you run another model, you could say, well, now we're this much better at predicting the future, so we added this much predictive value to our data, and that was fun and that was exciting, so let's do it again. Let's add in performance data, and if you keep building models as you go, you get to watch yourself improve with how you're doing. All right, so that's kind of the premise. We'll take a little bit of a detour quickly, and we'll talk about how you might do that in a very kind of statistical or objective way, right? Because in the past, you say, let's build some data, let's connect all of our data together. It feels like obviously valuable. If we have more data, we can build more dashboards, we can do more self-service. People have made the business case for investing in data for a long time before this morning and me stepping up on the stage. But if we think about how a machine learning model gets evaluated, then we might be able to get some analytics about our analytics, some kind of statistical ways of saying how good is our data at predicting the future. So a little bit of a quick refresher course for you on precision, recall, and F1 score and how you evaluate predictive models. So you train a model on past data. Then you don't tell it all of the past, you hold some of the answers back and you don't tell the model about those, right? And then once you've built your model, you can feed it a bunch of questions that you already know the answer to, and you can very intentionally see how it performs on those questions. So one thing you might test is its precision. So this is if your predictive model tells you that Ryan is going to terminate, right? Does Ryan actually leave? So when it says something, is it right about that? That's your precision. So if it told you 100 people are going to terminate, and only 42 of those people actually terminated, your precision is 0.42, or 42%. That's 1/2 of evaluating these models. But you need to bring in another side of it too, otherwise the models will kind of cheat on you a little bit, and we'll explain that. So you also have to think about recall, which is, if there were 100 people in your data who actually terminated, did the model find them all, right? So if it only found 70 of them, then its recall is 70%, or 0.7. Okay, and so when you have both of these things together, you can say, get a good sense of how good your predictive model is. If you only do one or the other, your model might do this. So if you only did precision, it might kind of hold out on you. They're not really sentient yet, but we'll kind of personify them, and then in 18 months they will be. But if you only looked at precision, it might just say, well, this one person, I'm really sure that they're going to terminate, so I'm just going to say that they're going to leave, and I'm going to go 1 for 1. And you'll have great precision, but you won't have a valuable model. On the other hand, if you only go for recall, it can cheat and say, everybody's going to leave. I found them all. So you have to put those two metrics together, and the obscure metric that does that is something called F1 score. So we have finally arrived, and this is what I think is that kind of magic metric that will tell you how valuable your people data is. It is the combination of precision and recall. And it's still a number between 0 and 100, or 0 and 1 if you're using decimals. So this is your Fitbit number. Like, this is your index that you can go through. And if you do this exercise of continuing to build predictive models on your data as you go, you can watch this number improve. And then you can turn to the business and the stakeholders and the people who are investing in this data, and you can say, we are objectively getting more intelligent. Right? Our score is moving up, we're getting fitter, we're getting smarter as we go. And you can do this now, this is the other theme. So you can do this now because the cost of building these models is really falling. You couldn't do this if you were gonna say, we're gonna run predictive analytics just in parallel with our data investments. Like, you'd be asking for way more resources. The panel just now was talking about, we need more data scientists in HR. Kind of, we need more people to think about models and how they work, but the technical work of building a model, increasingly you can offload that to software. So it doesn't have to be the case that we're gonna get our data together now, and then up in the future we're gonna do predictive modeling, and that kind of traditional roadmap, that can collapse now. And predictive modeling can just be integrated in the day-to-day work that you do. You can use it in this more trivial way. You can build a predictive model that you have no intention of putting on the results on a dashboard or running through your audit panel. You can just use the model to say, well, how healthy are we? How good are we? Let's look at the preliminary results. The value is in the act of reviewing the model, not deploying it, which is an interesting new way to think about these things. If building a predictive model takes you 3 weeks and 3 really talented data engineers, you're not going to use it in trivial ways. But if building a model takes you 3 hours and it's just the computer doing it, well, now you can embed it in your workflows. You can be using predictive models the way you use pivot tables today. And that's kind of exciting, and there's whole new avenues of thinking that opens up. So you should get out there, model early, model often, build lots of predictive models, let the cost of that fall, and think about using them in new ways. So we'll kind of summarize what I was hoping to walk through here, which is, given that the technical work behind building something like a predictive model is falling, you could now create this sort of embedded workflow that helps you tell the business about the value of your underlying people data. And you could even do it in kind of a preliminary way. You could say, well, should we invest in a data lake? What data should we put in there? Well, staple some of the data together, run it into a predictive model, and say, okay, if we got this data really elegantly structured in the future, we could be this predictive, right? And you can just kind of incrementally walk up the curve as you go. So build a little bit of a data model, see how your predictions perform, and be ready for them to be terrible at first. You can build a predictive model that you don't think is going to be very good. If you could predict your employee behavior based upon like their job title, location, base pay, and tenure, your employees are really predictable, and you probably would have figured it out by now. You gotta be ready to go on a journey with this stuff and bring in performance, bring in engagement, bring in labor market data, and see how the numbers start to improve. And you'll start to get a sense of what are the relative values of each of these data sets. And you can just repeat that on a loop. And if you start to think like this, even within the confines of this sort of specific problem, I think that some of your relationships with your internal colleagues will change, your kind of relationships to these projects will change, and that can be really fun. The first one I already sort of talked about, which is when it comes to justifying the value of making these investments, you can get really concrete and precise. And this is something I think we all feel like we should be able to do. We are analytics people. So when we do work, we ought to be analytic about it. We should have metrics for our own performance. And now we would have one of these metrics, a sort of general, how intelligent is our data metric. The other part of it is, from a motivation factor, incremental improvements are great. It's one thing to say, I should run more. It's another thing to say, like, can I run 5 miles? Can I run 6 miles? Can I run 7 miles? When you get a process that you can incrementally improve, it's really easy to be motivated. It's easy for people to get excited about it, right? Can we get our F1 score? Once you've kind of explained what that is, can we get our F1 score from 0.38 to 0.45? Can we get it to 0.48? How high can we go, right? And that's a really motivating, fun cycle to get in versus just, we should talk to IT, we should try to get the learning data in there. Okay, but hey, if we get the learning data in there, are we gonna know a lot more? Do employees stop learning when they know they're gonna leave, or do they ramp up on learning to kind of get the value before they head out? And it could be a little of both. But you'd start to be able to be more measurably smarter about what it means. I put center of excellence in here. I don't know, how you all are structured, but again, my colleague Ryan and I have been having really fun conversations with people, and the other day we were talking to a head of recruiting, and kind of in the middle of her world with HR and talent acquisition and analytics and all these things, they have this new onboarding program, right? And we started talking with her about, well, if you could build predictive models all the time, when you implement that new onboarding program, you could start to really weigh it and evaluate it and say, yeah, when we look at early turnover, the data from this onboarding program tells us an awful lot about whether people leave. And of course, that'll help you do interventions, and analyze the drivers, but it also kind of helps you say, as an organization, this is how valuable that data is. So she got excited, and I think that, again, can be ways that you can collaborate across functions within HR to say, let's get your data into our data model so we can understand measurably how much smarter your thing makes us all, right? And also, same idea, it can change your relationships with your vendors too. If you have if you use a learning tool or you use an engagement tool, and you get data from that vendor and you kind of put it into your core data, you can have I don't think it will be blunt, but I think you can have a very direct conversation with them to say, your data in the bigger picture of everything we're trying to do tells us about this much, about what's going on. And that's a new way to collaborate with them, a very objective way to collaborate with them. And we actually did this. So we worked with a vendor that does communication programs with employees. And we did a really lightweight test, because machine learning is cheap now, on their data without that information, and then we added in the information about, are you clicking on emails, are you engaging with the content? And sure enough, the model preferred all of that data. So rather than how much tenure do you have, it was really interested, the model was, in how much are they engaging with this content. And now you have this amazing story to tell that everyone can celebrate, which is this data improves our predictions this amount. All right. Just to wrap up, though, and we'll open up to questions here, of which hopefully there are many. I think we have some time here for questions. But so that was a particular idea. It was a particular way that you could use machine learning in a new way. And specifically, you could use it to sort of tell the story of this foundational work that you're doing as a people analytics leader to the rest of the organization in a very analytic way that supports the idea of you being an analytic person that does things analytically. It's like Moneyball for data orchestration, right? Okay. I've been thinking about this talk then for a couple of months, and what's been happening as I think about it is that, I keep talking with, Chris, our CEO, about, more of what's coming with AI, and that's very much more in the mode of, oh my goodness, 12 to 18 months from now, things might be wildly different, right? And so, while I wanted to give you a particular example today, I also wanted to give you an invitation to sort of zoom out and think about kind of the pattern of thinking that is different here, which is, how can I use a tool or a technology that seems really expensive today in a way that maybe would feel wasteful, today, but in the future is going to be totally normal? You used to take a picture on a camera, and you would go and you would get the pictures developed. I can still remember this. Hopefully most of you can still remember this. And now you can just take a picture on your phone, and we use pictures in different ways. So what are the other patterns that we're going to see? When the cost of doing the technical work really starts to fall, how do you think about use cases in a way that's totally different than you might now? And where I want to kind of push that invitation to you is that I think that so often, and very rightfully, we think about using resources in a really frugal way. We think about conserving resources, and this is obviously a good thing. Like for our world, for our society, we need to think about doing more with less. But when you are talking about technology and you're talking about AI, open up part of your mind to thinking about things in a more wasteful way. Like, what would be a completely wasteful way to use advanced analytic computing power? What's something we never would have thought about doing before that we can now do? And so leave part of your brain open for anti-frugal thinking. And again, one example of that might be, in the past, building predictive models was really hard. In the future, building predictive models is just an embedded part of how we measure our work. We don't even build them to share with our colleagues. We just build them to track how we're doing. We use them off to the side, right? You wouldn't have thought about doing that 2 years ago. And again, if things continue to advance the way that they are, there'll be all sorts of use cases that you have to think about that way. And so leave part of your mind open for that as well.